had a chance to, there we go. If you hadn't had a chance to get something from the back from Jimmy John's, please feel free to do so. For those of you who are not in the law school, my name is Max Gaston, the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here. And we're here to have a really important conversation with Dean G. Marcus Cole and Fathers Bob Loughery and Joe Corpora about the importance of LGBT inclusivity in the ministry of the Catholic Church. Dean Cole came to the law school in 2019, and ever since then, he's been very intentional about making sure and making it clear that at the law school, we're a space of inclusion, and that those of us who are Catholic are called to embrace that inclusivity. And so this is a conversation that we intend to continue well after this event, but since we only have an hour, I won't spend too much more time on this, and I will hand it over to Dean Cole and to our speakers to have this conversation. And just so y'all are aware, what we're talking about here are all questions that you submitted. So these are issues that have been raised by you for the three of these individuals to talk about. So hopefully we can get some clarity where there isn't clarity, and we can have everybody feel like they were heard in this conversation.
Thank you very much, Max, and thank you all for being here. As Max said, I think this is a very important conversation, and I wanted to have this conversation because, as all of you know, I'm Catholic, and I believe in our church, and I don't believe that we are members of a church that teaches hate. I think that we belong to a church that teaches love and inclusion, and so I want to explore how we do that, how we create a loving and inclusive environment here at Notre Dame Law School, what I call a truly Catholic environment for everyone. And to help us with that, we have Father on my very far right, Father Joe Corpora, who is the interim director for multicultural outreach in the campus ministry, and is also a consultant for the Alliance for Catholic Education. He graduated from Notre Dame in 1976 and from Moreau Seminary in 1977. He was ordained as a priest in 1984 and served 6 years at the University of Portland before returning to an assignment here at Notre Dame. Here in campus ministry, on campus, he works with students of color, economically poor students, and first-generation students, as well as LGBTQ students. I also have with us Father Bob Loughery. He currently serves as the rector of Sorin Hall at the University of Notre Dame, and before coming here to Notre Dame in 2010, he served as the pastor of the Downtown Chapel Roman Catholic Church in Portland, Oregon. So thank you, Father Bob, thank you, Father Joe, for being with us for this conversation today. To start off, can you tell us a little bit about your journey as coming to the priesthood and your interest in this area of inclusivity and working with marginalized groups?
Sure. Okay. All right, I'll go. I grew up Catholic in Indianapolis, Indiana. This back in the 60s. My parents, I think, taught us the importance of prayer and faith, but also service, being engaged in the community. That was very important in our learning. They were also part of what back then was called the Catholic family movement. So all this engagement in the community. So, you kind of absorb that when you're a kid, and looking at that, it's like, that must be important. My parents are doing this. So I studied architecture at Notre Dame. And after I graduated, I was working as an architect, and I found myself very involved in volunteer work with youth, with people in nursing facilities, the homeless, and so on. And so I was really kind of absorbed in that kind of volunteering, and I thought, I need to look at this. Like, what I felt myself not wanting to sit in an office drawing, but being out engaged with people. So with my Catholic faith and being taught the importance of service and engaging the two, I thought maybe the seminary would be something to explore. So entered Holy Cross, and my work has included parish ministry, campus ministry. I ran a homeless shelter in Oakland, California. I was a local director for the Holy Cross Associates program, which is like a Jesuit volunteer program. as pastor of a parish in Portland, Oregon, that was an urban parish, and ministry to those on the margins, the homeless, those with addictions, mental illness. It's a real exposure to folks like that. And so I just thought all my ministry is kind of moving towards that point of where I think this is where God is. And you wouldn't think that, but God's in the mess of human life and in the midst of things like addictions and homelessness and abuse, all these things. Like grace is here somewhere. We're gonna, as a community, find that. Also, just quickly, collaboration with the laity is huge. It's been some of the most rewarding aspects of my ministry, working with the laity. We did that at the downtown chapel. I've done it in other ways, and I think it's very enriching, and I love it. So that was part of my journey as well as a priest. I still have that hope and vision as a church that we collaborate with folks. One other thing, my mom was a nurse, and I think I really picked up on her healing kind of work, ministry maybe. And so healing was always something that became important to me. So I'm really drawn to stories in scripture about like when Jesus heals. I just think this is what people want. And I think in working with those who are on the margins, there's healing and it's so needed. And so that's why our church can be for those folks, so that they can find good news in their lives.
Brother Bill, how were you called to this?
I also grew up Catholic. I was born in 1954. My parents are first generation immigrants. My mom's parents were born in Syria and came from Syria, and my dad's from Sicily. So without knowing it, I already was sort of immersed in a bit of a multicultural world. I kind of had two halves, the Italian half and the Syrian half. They seem to go together just fine. Look how great I am after that. As it turns out, okay, maybe not. You know, as a Catholic kid, I wanted to be a priest. Like, I think children are fascinated with uniforms. I like wanted to wear a uniform. Now I like never dress in black. Yeah, came here to Notre Dame. It was the first time I saw priests as people living in dorms, just sort of part of our life, and eventually became a Holy Cross priest. As Dean Cole said, I was 6 years at the University of Portland. Then I was a pastor for 12 years in Arizona at a parish that was very economically poor, super poor, all Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants. And then I went to Portland, Oregon for 7 years as a pastor of a place that was changing daily from sort of a middle-class white Norwegian parish to more and more Mexicans every day. So anyway, that's, you know, Bob said, as God has a way of moving you to the next step without knowing you were already in the step that you moved to. And for me, that was simply the whole multicultural world that I grew up in. When I came to Notre Dame, I was a first gen student. We didn't have words like that in those days, but all of those experiences have, I believe, helped me have an eye for marginalized people, for people pushed to the periphery, because that's how it was. Yeah, I guess that's enough about me. Oh yeah, the most important thing I didn't tell you, and that is that I am a sinner whose sins are forgiven, and I love anything made with tomato sauce. Those are the two most important things about my life.
Well, I think it's true of a lot of us. So there's been a lot of conflict in the church, especially around issues of LGBTQ rights and acceptance versus tolerance. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, either of you talk a little bit about the role of the church, but also as us who are the church, Catholics, practicing Catholics, with regard to creating an environment that's inclusive and welcoming.
You know, I think back to my time at Notre Dame and friends back then, and a lot of us went to church every day, you know, good Catholics. These folks, these friends graduated, they moved on to careers, they got married, they raised kids. And after like maybe 20, 30 years, they're like, life is not black and white. You know, it's a lot of gray. They had to raise kids. One friend has a son who's gay. And it's like with the age, you kind of mellow in a way, like there are no answers in some things. You just have to walk with people and listen to them and engage them and realize you don't have answers for them when you start to be open to their experiences. So I think maybe we go from this I know it all to I don't know anything. I need to listen and pay attention and see what I can learn from what people share.
Father Joe, how do we create that environment of wisdom and share?
Yeah, so what I would say to that is, okay, so the most important word in the theological language of the whole church is A-N-D, because Jesus was God and man. The kingdom is here and yet to come. We are saints and sinners. Mary was virgin and mother. And you could list 100 more examples. If you begin to think in the world of and, then you begin to think about inclusivity and welcome. Because when we have, if you'll look at the history of the church, every time or becomes a really big word, we have a schism. So we're not big for the word or, we're big for the word and. It's inclusive, it's welcoming, it draws in. And, you know, I try, not so well, but I try to follow the example of Jesus, whose first instinct was to welcome people, to embrace people, and then to talk to them about their lives if they needed some sort of a correction or some sort of a encouragement. But the first thing was always welcome. And when the order is reversed, when the correction comes first, we never get to the welcome and the embrace. So how do we do that? How do you do that? How do I do that? How does you have to begin with the welcome and an embrace, as and Bob said, the desire to listen. Then all sorts of things can follow after that. But you can't begin in the other order. It simply won't work. And for the long time, the church began in the other order: correction, reprimand, and then if anybody was still listening, then we got around to welcome and inclusivity. But usually people had stopped listening by then. But if you look what Jesus did, like a woman taken in adultery, the first thing he does is he embraces her. He talks with her. He learns about her life. He asks her questions. They visit. Then he says, go and sin no more. But he gets the order correct. If we want to be a welcome, inclusive, embracing people of God, church, we have to use that order.
So I love, and you especially know this, I love my Holy Cross priests here on campus, but I was brought up through the Jesuits and immersed in Jesuitization education. And there's one Jesuit priest I'm particularly enamored of, that's Father James Martin, and his writings on this subject. I want to get a sense of your take on some of the things that he says. So, for example, he's got a book out now called Building the Bridge, I think, where he talks about the responsibility of both non-LGBTQ Catholics as well as LGBTQ Catholics to cross the bridge to meet each other. And I want to get a sense of what you think those responsibilities are. What can we've already talked a little bit about what we can do as those of us who are not LGBTQ, but what could LGBTQ Catholics do to narrow the goal?
That's a really good question. People in the minority, whatever happens to be, tend to lead with this, whatever it is. And people in the majority tend to think that that thing's not very important. So there's already a difference in the role that sexual orientation plays in our lives. So like, I don't know any heterosexual person who ever Googled, how do I know if I'm heterosexual? So, because that's just how it is. And so people start with that. And they're not often receptive to the non-heterosexual community. So the LGBT community often, not always, begins a little bit strong. Or from a position, a deficit position. And that can create some misunderstanding. So I guess one way to say it is everybody has to find out what their position of deficit is, and then understand how other people begin from that position to have a better understanding of how to do this. I don't know if that's a question, but it just simply means, or as the Pope would say, see the person. See the person. So no matter where you are on the spectrum of orientation, if you're LGBT talking to a person who's not, see the person. See the person. A lot happens after that. Nothing can happen without that.
And I would say too, I like that image of the bridge, and we're all, by baptism, we're all priest, prophet, and king. So the priest part is the bridge building. We're all supposed to do that. But if I cross the bridge and I've got an opinion about you, which almost comes from a place of disrespect, you're not going to have a lot happen. So don't look at the person with eyes of judgment. I've got you figured out. You're in a category. That's not respect. There has to be an openness. And we talked about earlier, we have to listen. We live in a culture where people do not listen anymore. Look at social media. It's all about people's opinions. And everybody's being formed in this culture now, and no one's listening. If you aren't listening, then you're not understanding. If you're not understanding, your heart's not going to change. So anyway, I think this is what we have to do when we come across the bridge together, to be respectful, to listen, and just open your heart. What was yesterday's reading? Come to me with all your heart. Rend your heart. I think we have to do that. We have to open our hearts to other people to listen. That's what Jesus would do, right?
By the way, I want to let you know that the questions that I'm asking are basically a synthesis of questions that you submitted before this conversation. So I'm trying to put the questions to our guests here in a way that will solicit the kind of answers I hope you were looking for. But one of the questions, I'm sorry, Father, go ahead.
I want to say that I think that we've invited Jim Martin to come to campus numerous times. He always wanted to do it via Zoom. Being a Jesuit, he only goes to Jesuit campuses. I figured this out already. But I think he would be saying at Notre Dame, we are doing a pretty good job. That's not to pat ourselves on the back, but we are trying to follow his lead in this, if you will. And yeah, I just want to say he's not absent from our thinking and our way of discussion. He's very much a part of it. And he is really, from the ground up, leading a whole way of rethinking all of this.
So several of the questions that came in are about the harm that the Catholics have done to members of the LGBTQ community who are Catholic members of the LGBT community, as well as people who are not members of the LGBT community. And as a Catholic, in a lot of ways, I feel hard and feathered with our track record with regard to racism, anti-Semitism, and in this area, what do we do? How do we fix this? How do we fix our reputation?
Look more like Jesus. And so what would Jesus do? Those wristbands? I mean, I think go to Jesus and learn from him. It's not with a friend of mine. We have to listen to his voice. Again, here's the listening thing again. What is Jesus saying to me in my life and this person's life? And that kind of opens things up. Then he becomes the one who leads the conversation rather than me or my little group. Yeah.
I would say to that, I don't know that there's been any public recognition on the part of the church of the harm they have done. I forget what year it was. I was a pastor in Portland, I think. I don't remember. Yeah, in Portland. When there was a whole nationwide prayer, and we began every mass one weekend by acknowledging the sins of the church against people. It was very powerful. I remember lying down. That's when I could still get up at the I could lie down on the floor and we prayed, Lord have mercy, one sinner among many, of the damage the church had done to people's lives. There has not been that for the LGBT community, or for many other people that have been wounded by the church. But anybody who knows, the most powerful thing my father ever could do in my life was say to me, I'm sorry I did this. So we think of the church as a parent at some level. When the parent can say, I screwed up here, I messed up, I'm sorry. It's not going to relieve everything, but it's a powerful start. And so when the Pope says things like, who am I to judge? When the Pope receives gay couples into private audience, when the Pope does these things, it's beginning in that direction, but we did a lot more. And quite frankly, the American Catholic Church would do well to follow the lead of the Pope more than they do. But there needs to be some public acknowledgement of the shame, the hurt, the harm that we have made people feel less than themselves, that they're not good. But that's changing, and not to say that we're there yet, but I do believe in your lifetime, I'm already on the fourth quarter. This can change more and more, but it has to be some sort of public acknowledgement that we did wrong.
So you allude to the change. Has church doctrine changed on these issues, on issues of sexuality, and do you see change imminent?
Well, I don't think it's changed, but what has changed is how we see people. Is change imminent? I would say the same thing all the time. The church used to think that slavery was good. Now it says it's bad. Used to think religious liberty was bad. Now it says it's good. So on so many issues, the final shoe hasn't dropped yet. And I don't know a whole lot about the church's history, but the church inevitably follows science. I mean, eventually the church said the world was round and not flat. So eventually the church follows science. And so as science says more and more and more and more and more and more, that being LGBT is not a chosen reality, it's not a chosen way of life, this will work its way into the church. Maybe those of you who are 25 will see this. I won't, but although I will say this, it's moving faster than everyone thought. You know, we didn't even say, we didn't have a word like LGBT 40 years ago, or have a discussion about it. Oh, for God's sake, the last thing we want. So it's moving faster than I would have thought. So who knows, once something picks up speed, the Holy Spirit will guide it and it will happen when it's supposed to happen. But I do think we can see, you know, when the Pope says, I believe in civil unions, so we're moving in a direction. I don't know what the end result will be, but
I was going to ask about that. So what does that mean? You know, the Pope says that states ought to provide an avenue for same-sex civil unions. What does that mean for the church?
Well, I mean, if two folks are seeking this civil union, I like to come from a place of, and they have good intentions. They love each other, and they want that love to flourish in the world. And I think for many people, stop there. No, you can't love each other. Well, they're saying yes, we're committed. And why would we turn off that flow of energy in the world when two people love each other? That's generative. It gives life, and yet we're saying no, we're going to shut that out. You can't. So it concerns me when we say your love doesn't matter. They don't believe that. So.
Well, sure.
I don't know if civil unions will eventually lead to sacramental marriage. I doubt it. But for most people, that's not their major concern. They just want to be seen and recognized and included. There are many people in the church who are not in sacramental marriages for 100 reasons. So I don't think it will lead to that, but I just think it will. I'm trying to think of an analogy, and nothing comes to my mind, but it's because I'm trying to think of what cookie I'm going to have in that box next year. But I do know that eventually, you know, law changes the way people think. Like we're going to all these lawyers, you know that. And if it is settled law, and eventually it'll seep its way into the way there'll just have to be more respect, be recognized as more places provide health care for the same-sex spouse. All of that will influence how people in the church think about things, even if we don't have sacramental marriage at some point. That's what I think anyway, and hope for.
Well, you mentioned the magic word. You said law, and so I was hoping to shield you from the legal questions, but
Keep shielding.
But I think that you've given me an opening, as we say in evidence class, to ask you about how the law and the church treats both women and LGBTQ members. So in law, we have a separate treatment for racial discrimination versus gender discrimination. And in the church, we have you guys sitting here, and you're male, and we don't ordain women as priests. Is there a parallel between the way the law treats women and the LGBT members of the LGBTQ community?
My first thought was we begin to speak to this. Somehow we see others as less than, and it's like they're not less than, but that's how women are less than, LGBTQ are less than. It's like, by whose standards? Who says? I mean, who makes that determination? I think there's this need to, it's in human nature, I need to feel superior to others. So that makes me feel like I belong in the world, I've got a lot to give, and I'm the authority. It's sort of human nature, but it's like, well, it gives you the right to say someone's less than you are. And I think the language we use and these roadblocks, these barricades we put in front of people, it's like, where's that coming from? We're all made in the image and likeness of God. Sometimes you wonder if people really believe that or not.
Yeah, I guess I would say it this way: if the church wants to be the best servant of God as it can possibly be, and then limits leadership to half of the population, and then to that half, only those who are going to be celibate, which is like 5% of that half, you're obviously cutting out possible candidates. It'd be like the best orchestra in the world, but you said you could only be in it if you applied on between noon and 2 on Good Friday, otherwise we wouldn't take it. So the point would be we limit ourselves, and I don't know what the church would look like, but and I just have to imagine that it would be more human, more welcoming. I don't want to assign that role to women only, but women certainly seem to be better at that. Oh my God, please don't get me along. But there's no doubt, wherever women are involved, you know, and the diocese now allows us to have the chancellor as a woman. It's a whole different reality than when it's not.
Yeah. And we've both done parish work. Who's running this? Who's making this thing work?
Right.
It's
Women.
women.
Really?
It is. Parishes would not function without women.
Yeah, at all conferences, if you have to go to the bathroom, you're glad you're a man because there's no line. The line for the women's bathroom at a conference of religious ed is like 3 miles long. So yeah, you're right.
So, well, you raise bathrooms, so let's talk about gender
I'm gonna be careful what I say.
and those issues as well. How does the church view gender identity issues, and how do we welcome Catholics who are facing the issue of gender identity?
This is a whole new reality. My sense is people now they're allowed or given permission to speak of what has been their experience, but they've never been able to speak of it. I know a student who's transgender, lived in my residence hall. I had a conversation with her, and I needed to listen. I get back to listening. She shared her story. It's like, wow, okay, I've learned something here, and it makes me again more open. So again, it's back to let me hear your story. Because I feel like the transgender concern and that people have this. This is how they come to know themselves. It's like again an opportunity. I need to sit, create space, open my ears, and hear their story.
Yeah, I am embarrassed that I don't know as much about this as I would like to know. I have spoken with several trans people, and I'm still trying to understand it better. I just have to be honest. I mean, but I know it's real. That I know. Because you can't sit with someone for an hour and a half and then walk over. Oh, that was just for fun. No, it's very real. I think, how can the church support it? I think of the Pope, who supports that nun in Argentina who's been running a home or it's like a factory, not a factory. A workshop for people who are trans, and that's how they get jobs. And Pope has supported that since he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and it talks about it every so often. You know, eventually things change at the church because everyone's talking about them. I just, you know what I mean? It just becomes part of our language. So though I have catching up to do, and I think most Catholics have catching up to do on this. But you can't catch up by going to the library and getting a book out. You have to talk to somebody and sort of get inside their skin, get inside their head, and see what it is.
When people are talking about how they
Just one more thing I was going to say is that Notre Dame is quite behind on this issue, if I must say so myself. But I was telling Dean Cole and Bob and Kaylee and Max the other day that the last 3 residence halls that have been built and the ones that are renovated on the first floor have a bathroom and a shower. So one wonders if that's for the future, thinking about transgender people living in dorms. You always find a bathroom on the first floor for the opposite gender, but not a shower. So anyway, I just wonder what that means. Bob, sorry.
Always felt that, Augustine writes about the heart's longing, and faith is really about longing, my longing for God, and sexuality is also about longing and desire. So they're 2 sides of the same coin, and yet it seems like we split them. And so if a transgender person is expressing who they are, they're also talking about their spiritual lives. And I really feel that we are spiritually abusing people. When we say you're less than, you don't belong, you aren't following the teaching, that's abusive, because they're sincerely trying to know who they are in God's image and likeness, and they're looking for God, they're trying to search for God. And I think the church should not dismiss that and just say, well, this is the teaching. Yes, we have the teaching, we have this too. It's and, it's not either or.
So, but this is where the rubber meets the road in real life, because you've got institutions like Notre Dame, you've got, I was telling you two about Catholic hospitals in California are confronting the issue of gender reassignment surgery and whether insurance for employees of Catholic institutions ought to cover that. The positions of the Catholic institutions has been up until now that gender reassignment surgery isn't healthcare, and so should not be covered by health insurance. Is that where we're going to stay, or is this longing that you're talking about a justification for Catholic institutions to change their position on this?
I hope those would become part of the conversation rather than hijacking it into the legal.
Right. I tried to keep law out of it. I really did.
Well, no, I'm just saying how I think that, like Joe and I think what we're trying to do is this is something we need to have as part of the debate or conversation, the direction we're going.
I don't know where, I do feel we're moving in a direction. In a better direction. I just don't know. This is part of the culture war of the church. I like to think of myself as a deserter from the culture wars, but it's almost impossible the way that we are. But so that means we have to live in an and language all the time. Otherwise you're getting a culture war. They're just so unhelpful. This would just be another one. When people get beyond that, it's just amazing how you can, how Joe Corpora can think when I can get beyond the culture war. You can just see better and hear better, listen better. You still might be confused and not know how to finally think this through, but you're at least on the path of thinking.
Well, I have to say this because the first thing I did when I got here was establish a religious liberty initiative, precisely because I don't necessarily think of myself as a defector from the culture wars. I'm just not interested in culture wars. I think that they are misguided and hurtful and undermine what's really important about what it is to be human. So I give people the example of freedom of speech. If the only people who were defending freedom of speech were Nazis, we probably wouldn't have freedom of speech because we wouldn't appreciate the value of that basic fundamental freedom. And I think that freedom of religion is even more fundamental. So I would rather have me defending freedom of religion than people who want to engage in a culture wars or want to discriminate against people on the basis of religion. And you know, I've often talked about, you know, we get a lot of attention for the cases that we take at the Religious Liberty Clinic, but we don't get attention for the cases that we turn down. We turn down cases where a diocese or some other religious organization comes to us and says that we want to fire this this gay teacher or this gay employee. But my first question to them is, yeah, I don't question your religious convictions, but are you also firing cohabitating teachers? Are you also firing, if you're Catholic, are you firing divorced teachers who remarried? That's all against Catholic doctrine. So if you're not consistent across the board, then I have to question whether you are engaged in advancing your faith or whether you're engaged in bigotry.
Absolutely.
So I think the culture wars are actually hurtful because they're undermining our understanding of our basic freedoms and our responsibilities as Catholics.
Yeah, you're right.
So let me ask you about the future. Where do you see us? Where do you see us going? Where do you see your ministry going? Both here at Notre Dame, but also the church.
Well, right now, our community's been engaged in conversations about the disenfranchised. I don't know about the future of the church. Young people are not showing up at the door. That concerns me. I don't know what the answer is, how to change that, if there's a way of doing that. Maybe some people think, well, because the church is not teaching what's the teachings of the church. Maybe, you know, but that's one concern I have is where are the people coming from? After COVID, people are just not coming back to church. What's that say about how come they're not being pulled in? Is there something we need to look at and say, maybe this is why? I mean, it is about inclusivity or welcome. I think people are using their minds to think about things, where I think, like even when I was a kid, in the late 50s and into the 60s, you did what you were told. That was good enough. Now people are like, well, I want to think about this, and I think go ahead on.
So how are we going to get it back? How are we going to get people who've been hurt by the church, or people who just may have not been hurt, but they've seen others hurt by the church and have walked away from this institution?
I know it just breaks my heart. They're walking away from the body of Christ, the sacramental union that we share. It really saddens me. They just, I'm not attached to this anymore. I think we failed. Like if Joe said, we're all sinners. Let's just start there. And here's the Lord saying, come, be at my table. We need the Eucharist every day because the Eucharist is a sign of union in a world that's divided. And so every day we have to come to this sacrament and really grapple with the grace that God's giving us. It's not like we earned it. Come to the table, be here together. And then we walk away and we continue our battles, our tribalism and the divisions that we are so used to now, it seems. Yeah.
I don't know how we're going to get them back. We talk about that in campus ministry all the time. I mean, when I was a student at Notre Dame 50 years ago, 95% of kids went to Mass every Sunday night. Now I think we're doing well at like 35%. It's just clear, And I don't know, it's not going to be some 6th Avenue marketing campaign. It's not going to be that. It's going to have to be lived lives of authenticity and integrity as best anybody can that might invite people to reconsider. It's going to be public apologies. It might be welcoming in a different, you know, when you see a bishop has a gathering for LGBT Catholics, well, for everyone that came, 20 didn't come and hear the word. So we just have to start doing things like that. You know, the Pope is conducting this worldwide synod, and at the end of it, it will be the largest number of people ever consulted on anything in the history of the world. It depends on how we're going to listen to this. I mean, we're doing it at Notre Dame, and we're learning fascinating things. And we have to say, okay, now what are we going to do with all this information? How will it change what we do day to day? How will it change? It will just have to involve more outreach, more engagement, more going out. You know, one of the Pope's first lines was, I prefer a messy church to a well-kept sacristy. So We just have to start doing more and more things like this, and pushing the envelope. I don't know what. I'm one who will. I don't believe the church is going to be saved by, and I'm not an enemy of adoration. I probably go 3 times a week, but that's not going to save the church. More hours of adoration or more confession hours is not going to do it. It's not doing it, at least in my judgment. Well, in not my judgment, I just say it's not working or coming. So we got to think of new things and creative things and how to get people to. Okay, an analogy with Catholic schools. During the pandemic, the number of kids in Catholic schools went up about 8% nationwide because many parents wanted their kids to go to school in person and not virtually. Well, that if I were the bishop or the superintendent, I would say, how do we engage people to take a second look at us? We're never going to get a chance again to have them take a second look. So let's have them take a second look now. Now they're already in our buildings. Somehow the church has to think about that, like how to get people to take another look after they've gone. I'm not a creative person. I know how to get things done, but I can't think well about how to do them. But give me an idea or two and I can work with it. How we can get people to take a second look at us who have walked away. And everybody knows people in that category. Your sister, your brother, your aunt, everybody. What would get them to take a second look? And it's not going to be another catechism. That's for sure. It just has to be this inclusivity, a way of welcoming, a way of hugging, a way of embracing, a way of saying you belong. We're glad you're here. Something in that, it just has to be in that category because nothing else will speak to people. That's what I think. I don't know how else to answer that.
There was lots of research on why people are disenfranchised, and I remember one was people looking for Jesus, and a sense of mission. They want engagement in the world. It's like, well, yeah, of course, but it's like, well, they're not finding it. So let's look at a church that's a mission-centered, mission-focused church. Again, that moves from the table of the Lord's Supper to the neighbor who's looking for that food themselves. Use our imagination and make these connections. It goes back to when I was a kid. Somehow I learned service is important. We're supposed to help our neighbor. And this is before Vatican II, where then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, faith and service engagement. And I think that's what people are saying now. This is 50 years later. It's like, where's the mission? Let's get that message across. And I think you might start, they're thinking more globally than 50 years ago. I think they're thinking more ways we never thought of.
Going off that one comment, I'm 67. When I was a boy, it was enough to believe in the institution called the church. And it's all you needed was the institution. That ain't working anymore. Now it's the person of Jesus. And unless that happens, nothing else will happen. I love the institution. I hope to die in the institution. That's not the point of it. But it's no longer going to keep young people with it for the rest of their lives. It has to be a person. The comment Bob's referring to, I forgot what 5 things were, but one was mission driven, one was the person of Jesus, one was an identification with the outcasts. So the more the church can be seen doing that, the better it is. I forgot what the other 2 are, but they all are good things that the institution the institution has still got a lot of life in her, but it just needs to, people won't, even I couldn't have stayed in the church if I didn't somehow come to know Jesus. The institution wouldn't hold me. You know what I mean? It just wouldn't do it.
Well, speaking of institutions, anybody who knows me knows that I love this institution like no other, and have since I was a little kid. But one of the most embarrassing moments of my life was standing in front of a television screen with my son, watching the assault on the United States Capitol on January 6th, and seeing a Notre Dame flag flying front and center among the rioters. To me, that was both embarrassing and humiliating. And I think of it because you mentioned the word tribalism in your last answer. And a lot of people have taken and merged the teaching of the church and church doctrine with their politics. And so now we see a real divide or polarization in our society. People who reject the church and reject a lot of the right-wing politics that many people who espouse to be members of the church have adopted. And then we've lost a lot of people. We've lost a lot of those people. We've got people who don't separate the teachings of the church and right-wing politics. What do we do about that polarization and tribalism?
Prayed for their heavenly reward as soon as possible. No, I don't know. In some instances, it can't be fixed. I don't know how to answer that when it's really to the extreme that you're talking about. When I suppose has to do with what you watch on television, what news you take in all the time. But we all know that we're all prone to watch what we think is real, and then we just keep watching EWTN and well, I better not get too specific. Lobo News. Lobo is Spanish for Fox. That's supposed to be funny. Go ahead and laugh. Thank you. I really don't know.
Okay, let me put the question another way. How should we as Catholics participate or abstain from politics?
No, we should participate. No doubt about that. I get what I was about to say, Dean Cole, is if a person is open to God, God has a way of like smashing into your life to make you think differently about things. Thomas Keating says, the surest sign you're going closer to God in your life is the constant dismantling of all the black and white categories you used to think in. And I just find that to be such a powerful line. So, but God being faithful will intervene everybody's life for something they didn't see coming and makes them rethink whatever it is. My sister, whom I love with all my heart and soul, got married outside the church. Now she got married in the church. But I would have thought today's her anniversary, by the way. I was like, oh my God, my sister living outside the church. But she was my sister. I loved her. I'm grateful she eventually got into the church. But it will never, that I can never think of people married outside the church the same way that I did before my sister did. So God will push something into your life, usually something you don't really want, to make you rethink things. And that's one way, the only way I know that we might be able to get people away from these tribalistic views and that they refuse to reconsider.
Yeah, it feels to me the church or believers are to shape the political discourse, not the other way around. And I feel like it's gone the other way around. And I think we have to get back to, we have to be the voice. Even if it's the voice standing alone, it's the voice of Jesus that we speak. I think the Pope has this thing, and we have to go to the margins because that's what truth is. It's not in the center of power. Power is corrupt. And yet I feel like we've said, well, we're going to be on the side of power. And Jesus went to the margins. He went to the poor because he knew they would hear the message. Maybe others eventually came around, but I feel the church needs to really be the church of the poor. And it's not. Because that's where you break down all these barriers and suddenly you realize you got nothing but God. That's what I learned in my ministry to folks who were poor, the mentally ill, the addicted, the people who've been abused. That's where we found God. And again, it was messy, but it was real. It was real. That's the thing. It was real because it was human. And then you hopefully engage the sacramental life of the church and all that too, of course. And then we see Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. The paschal mystery becomes really evident when you see these. I remember people, like at a time when this fellow came up to me, and this is in Portland. Father, I've had 2 days of sobriety. Good for you. I'm so happy to hear the good news, knowing he probably wasn't going to stay sober. But at least for a moment, he had a glimpse of something hopeful in his life. So that just, I think, can we as a church be in people's lives in that way? Always offering hope, but knowing we're sinners, we're broken, we need healing, we need God. That's what the church should be. preaching and not culture wars or,
Go ahead.
I try to spend breaks working at the border with Sister Norma. You might have heard of her, as people are crossing to come into the United States, and the brokenness, the sadness, the resilience. The stories are so real, so real. Yeah, those change lives. Stories change. Who is it? Ellie Wiesel said, "God created us because He loves stories," and stories just change everything.
So let me ask, how do we change the story here on campus, both the campus generally and here in the law school? What are some concrete things we can do to create a more welcoming and inviting and embracive and inclusive environment?
This is one.
Yeah. Stop.
Really, truly, something like this.
Also, stop judging. I mean, I'm as guilty of it as anybody. Stop judging. And if you set that aside, then again, there's this openness to be receptive. But if I'm judging, nothing's going to happen. So I would start with that. We all have to look at the ways we judge to start. But and expect a goodwill. I mean, people are not.
Yeah,
presume goodwill. Yeah, just lay that groundwork. I gather LGBTQ grads every few weeks or so on campus, and the idea is let's just create a space here where people can share their story and their faith. That's all we're doing. At least they have that opportunity to do that. I think the church needs to. That's important. The church does that.
The best definition I ever heard of judge was this: attributing motives to other people's behavior. And we do it all the time. We attribute motives to other people's behavior without knowing why the behavior is as it is. And people do it to you too. They do it to me. They attribute motives to my behavior. If we can stop attributing motives to other people's behavior. So, I mean, that's a conscious thing. But the university itself, I think Arlene told me we're like one of two schools that have, two Catholic schools that have 228 that have something like beloved friends and allies. But then that has to be put into practice.
We should explain what beloved friends and allies is.
Beloved Friends and Allies is a statement of the university on inclusion of LGBT students at Notre Dame. That'd be the best way of saying it, within the bounds of how the church understands and teaches. But again, people are more interested in being seen than in whatever else is after that. So we have to do more things like this. I think that, I don't know. I think when we're at a place when people hear campus ministry is doing an LGBT retreat, they realize it's not for conversion therapy. And I don't say that in a negative way. I think people are beginning to think or know what we're trying to do. But we have to be more intentional and about all these kinds, and not just in this reality, but in lots of different realities at the university.
What do you see as the biggest challenges coming to the university in this discussion?
This whole discussion, and I say this in a good way, is like a tsunami. We better get out in front of it and do what we can, because it is not going away. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. The whole question of gender identity, it's just not going to go away. So unless we sort of get in front of it and really take proactive steps to think about this, we're going to be simply playing catch up and looking dumb the whole time.
And again, presuming goodwill, these are people who are very intelligent and smart, they think about these things, and to allow that space again for them to speak what they've come to know at that point, rather than saying, well, stop there. This is what's taught. It's like, well, yes, that's important, but yet I want to hear what your process has been of discernment in this, and see what I can learn or what we can learn together. People are smart about this. Folks here in the room, they have LGBTQ friends and their allies, and this is not something hidden anymore. Back in our day at Notre Dame, oh my God, nothing came up about this, and now here we are. And I think part of the culture, people might say the secular culture is terrible, but it's like secular cultures actually allow people, in a way, permission to say, speak about who they are. Well, that's what the church should be doing. That's what we do. So I hope we can do that.
Another thing we have to be intentional about, I gather 12 students in my room once a week. Freshmen don't know each other. And it's not uncommon in the introductions for someone to say, I'm a lesbian. Nobody flinches. They're just going through discussion. So the diversity of the student body is outpacing the diversity of the faculty and staff fast. If this were like a war, the supply chain couldn't keep up with the reality. So I don't know. I mean, I know we make great efforts to be inclusive in hiring faculty and staff, but somehow we got to make, if not great efforts, other efforts, because it's not paying off. We're just going to end up with a student. I mean, I work with lots of students of color and economically poor, and quite frankly, most of the people working at the level I am don't understand what it is to be. Notre Dame knows one thing about poor kids. You want to know what about poor kids? They're not rich. That's about all they know. There's a lot to learn. And Notre Dame, you can know a kid is rich. You know that if their favorite restaurant is in another country. And you know how they know if they're poor, they can find a garage sale in 2 days. So, and I don't say that, I mean, it's kind of funny, but it's kind of true. So we really have to find out how to catch the staff and the faculty up with the diversity that we are deliberately recruiting.
Well, that works both ways, because we also have to make ourselves attractive to LGBTQ faculty and staff. And the only way to do that is to create an environment that they can see. And the people who are here already experience this as a positive one. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us here at law school on what I think is one of the most important discussions we can have. So thank you. Very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you to both of our speakers, and thank you to Dean Cole. Just really quickly as we wrap up, there are a lot of resources that are available to students who are LGBT and people who want to be allies to those communities. We do have campus ministries. We have the Center for Gender Relations. We have PRISM, which is an LGBT organization on campus. And like Father Bob was saying, Father Bob, you also do a weekly open door for members of the LGBT community?
Every 3 weeks.
Every 3 weeks.
Yeah, for grad students. Yeah.
Once a month on campus. I think last month was the first time we have an LGBT mass that happens in Dillon. So everyone is invited to that as well. There are a few other things that are in the way. Father Joe, do you want to talk about the speaker that's going to be coming later this month?
Michael Loughery, the National Rector for America, has written a book called Hidden Mercy, AIDS, Catholicism, and Compassion in the Face of Fear. She'll be on campus in March 22 to talk about the book. And how it's impossible because you're too young to understand how the AIDS pandemic has greatly shaped the whole LGBT law in the United States. So talk a little bit about that. Otherwise, it'll just be lost. But yeah, I'll send Max the flyer and we can send it around.
So look out for that. And if you're interested in that, please do attend. Thank you again so much for spending the hour with us, and enjoy the rest of your day.